There's a funny thing that happens when you do something 200 or more times. At first, you're just trying to get the next one done. But then pretty soon, the next episode, the next outline, all of that, the next little technical mastery, all that stuff eats 45 minutes of your life and whatever. And then somewhere along the way, you look up and you realize this thing you've been making week after week is no longer just pieces of content. It's a body of work. It's a signal, a platform, a relationship builder. It's a trust engine. And for lots of creators, it may also be one of the most valuable business assets they own, even if they're not treating it that way yet. Well, welcome to this episode number 200 of Legit Podcast Pro. Yeah, I'm going to acknowledge that number because 200 episodes is not nothing. That's a lot of microphones, outlines, legal rabbit holes, and moments where I looked at the news and thought, well, apparently that's an episode now. But this episode isn't really a victory lap, more like a marker, a line in the sand. Because after 200 episodes of talking about podcasting, media, law, business, ownership, deals, contracts and sponsorships and guests and networks and all of these AI and copyright trademarks, those kinds of things, and all the other things that make creators say, wait, I was supposed to think about that. One thing has become increasingly clear to me. The most successful podcasters aren't merely making shows, they're building businesses. And the ones who understand that sooner tend to make better decisions, better deals. They protect more of what they create. They avoid more predictable messes. And they look more professional to sponsors and collaborators and partners and clients and audiences. And they're much better positioned when opportunities come knocking. So today, I want to talk about what successful creator businesses have in common. Not just successful podcasts, but successful creator businesses, because that's where this show is headed. Still rooted in podcasting, still practical, focused on the legal and business issues creators need to understand, but with a bit of a broader lens, because the podcast is often just the beginning. So stick around. All right, let's start with a simple idea. A podcast is rarely just a podcast. Sometimes, yeah, it is, of course. Sometimes it's a hobby or a passion project or a creative outlet or just a way for friends to get together and do something fun together, or maybe it's a way to serve a small community. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. Not everything has to scale. Not everything has to be optimized, monetized, systematized, repurposed, or jammed into a funnel with 14 automations and a spreadsheet that looks like air traffic control. Sometimes it's just a show. But for lots of people listening to this, that is not the whole story. Your podcast may also be about building authority, attracting clients, creating relationships. It might be opening doors to sponsors, partners, affiliates, speaking opportunities, courses, memberships, communities, consulting, licensing. It might be making your audience feel like they know you a bit before they ever talk to you. And it may be creating a library of intellectual property. In fact, I'm sure it's doing that. It might be making your name, your voice, your ideas, and your format, and your point of view, and your brand more valuable. So it's not just content. That is business infrastructure. And once you start seeing it that way, your decisions will start to change, and you'll stop asking only, well, what should this week's episode be about? You start asking better questions like, what am I building here? What assets are there? Who owns them? What kinds of relationships am I forming and promises am I making? What are the revenue opportunities that are connected to this? And what would break if this were to get bigger? Most importantly, you're asking, am I treating this like a real business asset, or am I still treating it like a side project that happens to have an upload schedule? Well, that question matters because a lot of creator problems don't come from bad intent or even neglect. They come from success arriving before the structure does. The show grows, the audience grows, money starts showing up, collaborators want clarity, sponsors want rights, networks want control, guests want changes, co-hosts want a bigger share, and platforms sometimes change the rules. And suddenly the creator says, whoa, how did all this get so complicated? And the honest answer is, it was always that complicated. It just hadn't become obvious yet. After 200 episodes, here's one of the biggest lessons that I've learned. The creator business problems that look sudden usually aren't. They usually come from early decisions that were never revisited, or maybe not even ever made. A co host relationship starts with enthusiasm, but there's no contract. Well, that turns into problems. A show name that sounded great but never was cleared or protected. A guest interview recorded without using a release. A sponsored deal accepted without really understanding the scope of the rights that were being granted. Maybe it's a producer relationship based on, well, we'll figure it out later, or a network deal where the creator didn't fully understand who controls the feed, the back catalog, the ad inventory, and so on. These are not exotic or esoteric problems. They are ordinary problems, predictable. The kinds of problems that show up when creative people build momentum without pausing long enough to put the business foundation underneath. I totally get it. Nobody starts out a podcast because they're excited to write up a collaborator agreement. Very few people wake up and say, you know what would be really good to light me up today? Careful look at indemnity language. And if that is you, call me. We might be related. But legal and business structure is not there to ruin the fun. It's there to protect the fun, to protect the creative work, the relationships, the brand, and yeah, protect the revenue and the opportunity. It protects the thing you are building before that thing becomes big enough for people to fight over, because that's often when these issues arise and surface, not when the show is small. It's when it starts to matter. So, what do successful creator businesses have in common? Well, first, they understand what they own. That sounds basic, but it's one of the biggest fault lines in this world. Who owns the show, the name, the recordings, the edited episodes, the clips? And who owns the YouTube channel? Who owns that RSS feed? That's the access to the audience, right? Who owns the show format? What about the list, the email list, the audience list? Who owns the courses or membership or products that grew out of the show? And who owns the content if one of the co-hosts leaves? Or if a producer or designer or a contractor was involved in creating a part of it in the first place? Not theoretical questions. These are the questions that determine whether you control your own business. Successful creator businesses don't just assume the answers. What they do is they document them. They get it in writing, clarify the rights. They use contracts, agreements. And they understand the difference between having access to something and owning it. They understand that paying someone doesn't automatically mean you own everything they made. They understand that being the main person behind the show doesn't automatically answer that ownership question. And they understand that ownership isn't just a legal technicality, excuse me. It is leverage. It is control. Yeah, ownership is what lets you license and sell and repurpose and archive and monetize and syndicate and expand everything that you've built and enforce your rights. A creator who doesn't know what they own isn't really in control, are they? Yeah, they might be in control of the microphone and the cameras and the lights and things, but that's not all the same thing. Successful creator businesses use contracts. They enter into written agreements before things get weird. Yes, agreements sometimes feel awkward, especially when a relationship starts out feeling really friendly, or when it's new, when there isn't much money yet. Why are we haggling over all this stuff? It doesn't matter, right? Well, it will someday. When everybody's excited and nobody wants to be the person who says, so what happens if this all goes sideways? But that is exactly when it's actually easiest to get the agreements down on paper and make things happen in a logical, smart way. Before there's a conflict, before there's real money at stake, that always gums up the works. Before there's resentment, before someone wants out or wants to sell, before that sponsor's check arrives or the show starts getting big attention, and before everyone suddenly has a clear memory of what they believe was promised. And guess what? Everybody's memory is different. A good agreement is not just a lawsuit document. It is a conversation tool. It really forces you to discuss the things that are otherwise really tempting to just leave sort of fuzzy, ambiguous, open. Who does what? Who owns what? Who gets paid? Who has approval rights? Who can use the content or make deals? And what happens if someone leaves? What happens if the show ends or if there's a sponsor comes in? Maybe it's a big sponsor, right? What happens if this becomes more successful than anyone expected? That last one matters. They all matter. A lot of creator agreements are really success planning documents in disguise. It's not just about preventing disaster, it's about making sure the business, the enterprise, the adventure can handle growth. A hobbyist will say, well, we'll figure it out later. But a professional says, let's figure out the key stuff now so later doesn't become expensive or a big headache. Successful creator businesses, this is number 3, they create and protect the brand. Your show name might be more valuable than you think. The title, logo, tagline, maybe segment titles, community names, your course, your membership title, or your production company name could all become things that people recognize, recommend, search for, and that really kind of embody the trust that they place in you. That is what's called brand equity. And brand equity deserves protection. Now, not every podcast title can be protected as a trademark. Not every name is strong. Not every use creates the same rights. And not every creator needs to file a trademark application the second they publish episodes 1 and 2. But successful creator businesses do take this brand protection thing seriously. They don't build for years under a name that they never bothered to clear or protect. They don't assume that because they have the domain name that the brand is also theirs. They don't assume that because no one's complained yet that no one can. In fact, just earlier today, I was talking about a podcaster that has a show about called Mormon Stories, and now the Mormon Church is coming after them because they didn't clear it 20 years ago when the show started. No one assumes that because nobody's complained, no one can. They don't wait until they have a sponsor or merchandise line or course or network or a buyer before they ask whether they actually have the right to use and protect the brand that they've been building. Brand isn't just a design choice, it is a business asset. As people start to trust the name and search for it or buy because of the name or recommend it or associate the name with your work, well, then the name matters, right? And if the name matters, it shouldn't be treated as an afterthought. Number 4, successful creator businesses build systems that lead somewhere. This is where a lot of podcasters get stuck. They publish consistently, but the show doesn't really connect to anything. There's no offer behind it. There's no list building. There's no community or product or service. No next step for people to take if they love what you're doing and they want to support you. There's no clear relationship between the content and the business. And that may be fine if you're doing a hobby show, but it is not a strategy for creator business. If the show matters to your business, the show needs a job. Now, that doesn't mean every episode has to sell something. Please don't turn everything into a pitch fest. Nobody wants to subscribe to an infomercial that looks like a podcast. But the overall ecosystem should have a purpose. It should be building trust, creating movement. It should invite the right people to take that next step. It should support a business model, so it needs to be thought about. For some creators, the podcast is driving client relationships. For others, it supports a course or a membership or a community, a sponsorship package, a consulting practice. Maybe it's an event or a book or a licensing opportunity. Sometimes the show itself is the product, right? Often it's the engine. The distinction matters because once the podcast becomes part of a larger ecosystem, you're creating more than episodes, you're creating assets. Email lists, courses, templates, communities, processes, brand materials, guest relationships, sponsor packages, client pipelines, licensing opportunities, training materials, frameworks. All of these are assets that need ownership, protection, rights, permissions, and agreements and disclosures, and sometimes they have some compliance issues that attach to them. And the moment you build your systems to support your show, you're not a podcaster, not just a podcaster anymore. Now you are a business person. Number 5, successful creators' businesses ask a question most creators just don't ask, forget to ask. What happens if this works? Not what happens if it fails. Creators worry about that all the time. What if nobody listens, or the episode flops, or the launch doesn't work, or the sponsor says no? All of those are very real, very legitimate concerns. But legally and structurally, the more interesting question is, what happens if it works? What happens if the show grows? What happens if sponsors say yes, if the guest becomes famous, or you get famous guests? What happens if the clip goes viral, or a network or a sponsor or a buyer or a partner comes along? What happens if your co-host wants out after the show has some value? What happens if your course takes off, or a competitor copies your format or brand? Growth doesn't eliminate risk. It just changes the kind of risk that you may face. And that's why this creator business mindset really matters. It's not a question of just, how do I make this bigger? It's, can the structure support the success I'm trying to create? And if the answer to that is no, or not yet, then bigger may just mean more fragile, more visible, more complicated, more expensive to fix later on. So, what does all this mean for this show, Legit Podcast Pro? Well, this is still about podcasting, but not exclusively podcasting, and not only in the narrow sense of mics and platforms and episode formats and downloads and copyrights and trademarks and contracts. This show is for podcasters that are building something bigger. It's for creators that are starting to realize that their content is more and it's connected to a business. It's for media entrepreneurs and production companies, podcast networks, consultants, experts, educators, coaches, and creator-led companies that use content to build trust, generate revenue, and create intellectual property that opens doors. We will still be talking about podcast guest releases and sponsorship agreements and copyrights, trademarks, fair use, music contracts, defamation, privacy, and all the legal issues that affect podcasters. But we are going to keep asking a bigger question. What's the business that's being built behind the content? Because that's where the real value is. It's not just in the episode. It's in the ecosystem. Not just in the download, it's in the relationship. It's not just in the audience, it's in all these assets, and not just in the content, but in the business. Because that's the shift. For a long time, we creators were encouraged to think like publishers, like influencers, then like media brands. Now the serious ones really need to think like business owners. Not in the joyless corporate spreadsheet first kind of a way, but in a clear-eyed, I'm building something valuable and I'd better know how it works kind of way. That means knowing what it is you own, what it is you're licensing, and who has rights, and how the money flows, and what promises you might have made. Knowing what happens if relationships change, or where your exposure is, and what needs to be in place before your success creates problems, or I should say surfaces problems, that your enthusiasm really can't solve. So as we mark this episode number 200, I want to leave you with this. It's a simple self-audit. Just ask yourself the question and write this down. What is it I'm really building? Is the show a hobby or a marketing channel or a media property or a client acquisition tool or a community platform or a course engine? A sponsorship vehicle, a networking strategy, the beginning of something larger? Write your answer down. What assets have I created? Here's the laundry list of things that you should think about. The name, logo, the episode content itself, the clips that can be drawn from it, all the repurposing, right? The transcripts, the guest relationships, the audience and the email list, the frameworks. What are the offers and the systems? And do I know who owns all of those assets? Do I have all the agreements, the contracts in place that I might need? Is my brand protected? Is my content connecting to a business model? And finally, ask yourself, what would break if this got really big? That may be the most important question of all. Because if you can identify what would break, guess what? You can fix it before it breaks. That's the work. This doesn't come out of fear or panic. It's not everybody's going to sue you, right? The traditional lawyer scare you into hiring me model, right? No, this is just grown-up creator business thinking. You're building something valuable. Let's make sure you actually own it and protect it and know what to do with it. So that brings me to something I've been working on. I'm developing a new resource called the Creator Business Protection Blueprint. I expect to have it out in a week or two. A practical framework to help podcasters and creator business owners identify what's protected, what's vulnerable, and what needs attention next. Like I said, it's still in development, but it's coming soon. And if you'd like early access when it's ready, head on over to my website, gordonfiremark.com/blueprint, where I've got an early access list. And just give me your information at gordonfiremark.com/blueprint. And I'll get the information to you as soon as it's ready. And as always, if this episode gave you something to think about, share it with another podcaster or creator or media entrepreneur who's building something bigger than just their content. 200 episodes in, I am just more convinced than ever that creators are building real value. The challenge is making sure they recognize it early enough to protect it. And with that, I will sign off, saying to you, I'll see you next time on Legit Podcast Pro. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and I'll see you again real soon. Thanks for joining me.